18 minutes past 5 now here in Moscow. The head of US state media recently included RT on the same list as terrorist groups Islamic State and Boko Haram. And it appears we're also on the mind of another American official too, the State Department's Victoria Nuland. But she believes RT actually poses no threat at all because our audience is, according to her, quote, tiny. Garnet Chichikan next looks into the US officials' attitudes towards RT.
Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland was asked whether RT ought to be shut down. Jill Doherty, who asked the question, noted that RT is watched a lot in the U.S. and that it is getting a lot of attention. Victoria Nuland said the channel should not be shut down because of freedom of speech in the U.S. But then she went on to say this.
We believe in freedom of speech, freedom of media in this country. I think it's, you know, all you have to do is look at RT's tiny audience in the United States to understand what happens when you broadcast untruths in a media space that is full of dynamic, truthful opinion.
We've been getting a lot of attention, and not just from our viewers.
The propaganda bullhorn that is the state-sponsored Russia Today program has been deployed to promote, actually Russia Today Network has deployed to promote President Putin's fantasy about what is playing out on the ground.
We are in an information war, and we are losing that war. I'll be very blunt in my assessment. The Russians have opened up an English language network. I've seen it in a few countries, and it's quite instructive.
We can't allow ourselves to be outcommunicated by our enemies.
Victoria Nuland's comments come just days after the head of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, government agency that oversees U.S. state media, put RT at the top of his challenge list before Islamic State and Boko Haram. The State Department said they would not put RT in the same category, but they said RT does present a challenge for the U.S. government. So we are confused. How can RT be such a challenge if it has a tiny audience? In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekyan, RT.
Well, plenty of ways to catch up with us too. Talking of which, online from us, RT.com, we reveal why drinks and drones don't mix. A decidedly tipsy US defense official apparently tried his hand at flying a quadricopter thing, only to end up crashing it into the White House garden. Whoops. Full story there at RT.com. Also, astronomers believe they've discovered a monster Saturn, as they're putting it, with rings so large they've got rocks the size of Earth in them. That's big. Get up close and personal with the exoplanet, as they're calling it, on our website, if you want to read up more. Private jets and enormous yachts aren't just status symbols. They're, of course, practical too for the world's super rich. They're a good means of escape if you need to. And one veteran investor speaking at Davos recently explained to delegates there how hedge fund managers and the like are getting ready indeed to jump ship should the poorest in society rise up against them. We caught up with Robert Johnson to explain exactly what he was talking about.
On the Upper East Side of New York, at various parties and so forth, people talk about their own airplane with their own pilot, who he and his family will be protected too, building airstrips, buying compounds like farms in New Zealand as a place to evacuate to. Others, I understand, are buying protection from private security forces that could airlift in and take you out of a city that's in turmoil.
Robert Johnson again also told us what he thinks is driving the world's wealthiest to consider fleeing to the planet's remotest areas to hide out.
In the international system or within nations, you see very substantial unrest, some of it race-related in the United States, but inequality is getting more and more severe all over the world. And so I think people, when they see a sense of order, when they see a future, they, how I say, have a faith in the system and they continue to play. When they think it might be cracking up, they try to figure out how to protect themselves.
Around the world, riot police have fired tear gas inside a subway station in the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo. Demonstrators had attempted to enter the metro there without paying for tickets before trying to stage a sit-in then. It was the latest rally, indeed, against rising fares, which have gathered thousands of supporters lately. Protests have hit several other cities too, with demands that some public transport be made free of charge. Japan and Islamic State have agreed on a hostage swap, it seems, today. It's thought Japanese journalist Kenji Goto will be freed within hours in exchange for an Iraqi bomber imprisoned in Jordan. Islamic State had been parading 2 captured Japanese citizens, later killing one of them. Rebels in Yemen have freed a presidential aide that they'd kidnapped. His abduction led to the collapse of the government and plunged the country into political paralysis. The release is said to signal that the Houthi movement then is now ready to ease the crisis. The group's been pushing for more autonomy and power for Shias in Yemen. Washington signed off a fresh $2 billion loan to Ukraine, as agreed by the US Treasury Secretary in Kiev on Wednesday. And that comes less than 24 hours after EU finance ministers unlocked the same amount of cash to help Ukraine avert looming bankruptcy. As for Kiev's other lender, the International Monetary Fund, President Poroshenko's asked it for extended and increased support, but the IMF says that will only be forthcoming if the situation stabilises and the required reforms are in place. Some of those changes are extremely unpopular in Ukraine right now. As an example, this is something that's been happening in Kiev, where up to 1,000 miners have been protesting against the privatisation of the country's coal industry, something the IMF is demanding as a condition for its aid. The crowds marched on a government building there, angered by the authorities' plan to reduce support to the industry. That's only part of the austerity budget, of course, passed late last year, that included spending cuts, tax hikes and public sector layoffs. In fact, when you look at the figures, it's estimated that Kiev needs at least $15 billion now to avoid default this year. The country's debt is already over 70% of its GDP, and 2014 saw inflation spike up to 25% as prices soared. So a tough road ahead for Ukraine, just as its cash flow is at its tightest. We'll keep you posted over the weeks and months here. Thanks for choosing RT International. It's now 25 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, Moscow time. Up next, boom bust, taking a look at what Greece's new anti-austerity government means for the Eurozone. The next live update here, just over half an hour's time with me, Kevin Owen.